Well, the country's new Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, will take up the role next month at a time when the judiciary is under pressure to do more to transform. During interviews for the role, it emerged that labour conditions were still a problem for women judges who are either still being denied opportunities or dealing with prohibitive and unclear rules on issues such as maternity leave and a lack of a clear sexual harassment policy. Women and black lawyers have also complained in the past about big briefs still going to either male-dominated or white-led law firms. What needs to happen then to change all of this? Let's tackle the issue tonight or this afternoon with Siam Samai, who is the director at the Women's Legal Centre. We also have Charlotte Mahlaji, who's the Secretary General at the Black Lawyers Association. Rounding up our panel this afternoon is Zikhona Ndlebe, a research and advocacy officer at Judges Matter. My thanks to you all. Thank you so much for being on Newsfeed PM. If I can begin with you, Siam, do you see the appointment of another man as Chief Justice with Raymond Zondo now coming in as a step backwards for transformation, especially where gender is concerned?
Yes, it was an opportunity for the president to actually look at Section 174 of the Constitution, but also broadly our other commitments, which is international obligations, to ensure that there's broader gender transformation. And when one looks at the stats, although many things have happened over the past few years, not enough has been done to be able to ensure this gender transformation. And I think even though Section 174 allows the president, who consulted with the JSC, etc., to make his own decision, also, in addition to that, all four of the applicants were all fit and proper. I mean, we shouldn't take away from that. And I do think that, but at the end of the day, Judge Maya, for many, has pushed through the glass ceiling. And when we look at the statistics, which was in a recent research paper or research document done by Nadal, which is called Tipping the Scales, which was a 5-year study, you can see that even though there has been significant increases within the judiciary, including the magistracy, there isn't enough women. There remain more law students, women coming through the sector. But when we talk about leadership or within particular positions, we do not see those numbers. And I think it's important that we need to be able to engage with the research.
All right.
And the president had to look at those imperatives. And I think the JSC most probably looked at all of those imperatives when they made their recommendation.
Charlotte Mahlaji, with the Black Lawyers Association, your assessment then of how much the judiciary has done as far as transformation and overall the legal fraternity, how's it faring? Charlotte, are you able to hear us?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon to you and to the viewers. Our assessment of the transformation in the legal sector, as far as we're concerned, as much as there's been strides in the judiciary, especially in the magistracy, we have seen some strides and there's some kind of improvement. Even in the judiciary, the JSC has actually done quite some work to make sure that in the Supreme Court of Appeal, for instance, we see a level of representativity for females, although not to a point that reflects the demographics of the country. In looking back into the profession as a whole, especially in corporate South Africa, reports have shown that very little has been done to make sure that there's change. The market is seriously saturated by white males, and in instances where there are few females in positions of power, some are attributed towards issues such as funding. So there's a big problem in the corporate sector that we are battling to make sure that those tendencies are eliminated. Another challenge is not only in corporate, but again in practice, we see that there's very few female SOG advocates. There's many women that are experienced as female attorneys, but however, they have little exposure into the market, and this is influenced by factors such as briefing patterns. When you don't have work, you can't appear in court. And that in itself limits you to exposure into the work to gain experience. And as such, the market, when it comes to issues of shortlisting for active purposes and even in permanent position for the judiciary, becomes a factor. Having said that, we still have a lot of women that are qualified and that have been pushing through the ceiling and have done great work and are competing on the same level as the male counterparts. However, those women struggle to be shortlisted in positions such as acting positions. They struggle to be appointed in corporate, in firms that deal with profitable and meaningful work. So it's a big struggle. Therefore, transformation will continue to be a topic that we fight and make sure that people are transforming. People should be forced to transform. It's not only the BLA, but the profession as the whole, with the support of the Legal Practice Council, for instance. It has embarked on a procurement of a policy that would guide the sector.
Okay.
And unlike the past, this one would be enforceable in instances where practitioners and the state as well as corporate does not comply with the consequences.
Let me bring in Zikona from Judges Matter. Zikona, does the judiciary need to be led by a woman in order to be truly sensitive and proactive in addressing the need to have more women in these influential positions and given roles even by law firms?
That's a very good question, Tembekile. So if you look at studies in 2020, there was 41% of women judges in the superior courts, and there was 46% of women in the magistracy, in the lower courts. And if you look at the Supreme Court of Appeal, a lot of transformation took place ever since Justice Mandisamaya became the president of the Supreme Court of Appeal. So if I were to answer your question, I would say, let's look, for example, at the Supreme Court of Appeal. We've seen a lot of transformation take place there. And perhaps it could be because that court has been led by a woman, but there is no evidence to support that. So it's just me saying perhaps we have to look at the SCA. But it's not absolutely necessary that we have a woman in leadership in order to ensure that there's transformation and sensitivity to the transformation agenda. We all have to be alive to the fact that Section 174 of the Constitution speaks to transformation in terms of race, in terms of gender. It is not necessary that there needs to be a woman in the leadership position. It would have been great if Justice Mandisamaya was appointed as the Chief Justice, but that is not to say that Justice Zondo cannot ensure that the transformation agenda still continues as he has been appointed as the next Chief Justice.
Let me come back to you, CM, because in President Mandisamaya's interview, she mentioned that one of the people who was most helpful in her journey as a qualified professional who had hopes and dreams and was an ambitious woman was Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, who's a senior name in South Africa's legal fraternity. Do you find that often women have to find a man who's able to use his influence, his position, to give them that room to then be able to work?
Well, I do think, in terms of broader transformation, when we talk about transformation, we also talk about power. And it's about sharing power. And I think that, within the broader leadership position, I think it's very important, and we need to be unapologetic about this, that men then have to step back. Not just because of the fact that in terms of, finding, because you're a woman, but it's also because those women are competent. If you look at the statistics, if you look at the transformation agenda, I think it's all important, to be able to ensure that there is transformation. But yes, men can be mentors, leaderships, within the profession, and to ensure that there is gender transformation.
I suppose, just on what you're saying,
because it's constitutionally effective.
Just on what you're saying, it also has to be done in a way that is not patronizing, because often women have also said that when these opportunities arise, you're treated as though you've been done a favor by being given a seat at the table.
Yes.
Right. Let's hold it there for now. We're going to continue our discussion. We're discussing transformation in the judiciary. This is Newsfeed PM. Welcome back. You're watching Newsfeed PM. We're focusing this afternoon on transformation and gender equality in the country's judiciary. A few days ago, President Cyril Ramaphosa confirmed he'd appointed Justice Raymond Zondo as the country's new Chief Justice. One of the top contenders, in fact, the woman who was recommended for that post, is the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, Judge Mandisa Maya. The President says he intends to nominate her to become Deputy Chief Justice of the country. Our panelists are still with us. We're joined this afternoon by Sihem Samai, who's the director at the Women's Legal Center. Charlotte Mahlaji is the Secretary General of the Black Lawyers Association, and Zikhona Ndlebe is also still with us, a research and advocacy officer at Judges Matter. Let's just pick up, Zikhona, on the point that Sihem was just making a short time ago about women being in these spaces and not being done a favor or treated as though they're there because of male courtesy. Are attitudes changing from men who are either part of the bar or indeed in the courts themselves?
Well, it's actually a very slow change if there is. There are those men that understand that women are just as equal, they are competent, and they are able because they've seen them in action and they work with them. But you have others who feel that for you to be able to have access to platforms that are meaningful, platforms that would make sure that you get exposure, would at some point be expected to do favors. And that's where we, as women, should continue to actually stand together and educate each other as women, affirm each other's positions that we are not being done a favor. We went to school just as much as they've done so. We've written all the tests and exams that they've written. We're working as hard, if not more, many times than them. Therefore, we should not be apologetic about our positions in society, our position in the industry, and as well as in the judiciary. Often you would hear in interviews that we need to make sure that there's a balance. And when you think about it, in society, women in numbers, we actually, percentage-wise, more than 51% than males. And as such, we should not be begging to be equal in number. We should actually be more in representativity to resemble the demographics of this country. So we want them to come along, to be alive to the fact that we are here, we are capable, and we will continue to fight through the boundaries that are being created by those that are not willing to transform.
Zikhona, let's talk about something else that came out during the Chief Justice interviews, the lack of a clear sexual harassment policy, for example, in the judiciary, the lack of a clear policy on maternity leave. It was a shock for many of us because you'd assume that a space that is as legal or that is standing on basically on the country's running on the law would be sensitive to that and that would be clear. Why has it not been clear?
You know, it was very disappointing, Thembekile, when Justice Maya and Justice Mlambo mentioned that there was no sexual harassment policy in the judiciary. And that's a fact. There is no sexual harassment policy, not in the superior courts, not in the lower courts, not in the magistracy. As we've done research, we have had a look into these issues, and we have found, even before the interviews, that there is no sexual harassment policy. And it's quite sad, and it's very unfortunate that this is the case, but the reality is that judicial officers are human as well. Judicial officers do need to have ways to deal with their issues in their working environment. And accountability is the most important thing. If a judge or any other judicial officer is guilty of sexual harassment, then they have to be held accountable. Clearly, a complaint to the JSC against the judicial officer against the judge, and a complaint to the Magistrates Commission against the judge is not enough, because those systems are not working currently. We see that there are complaints that are taking years to be resolved, and sexual harassment is a very sensitive issue that has to be dealt with immediately when it comes to the fore, and it has to be nipped in the bud, and that is something that is not happening. So all the leaders of our courts need to take a stand against sexual harassment and ensure that there are policies in place. As we heard with Justice Mlambo's interview, in Gauteng there is a sexual harassment policy, but obviously it has to work. It has to be implemented. If it's not implemented and it doesn't work, it is pointless having it.
And CM, it's counterproductive, isn't it, to say we need more women on the bench, we're serious about transformation and gender equality on the bench, yet when you look at women who want to go into that space, if there's no maternity leave policy, for example, why do you want to go into a space that would stand in the way of your personal goals, family goals even, if you do wish to have children?
True, it's actually a form of exclusionary method. If you are a young female who's capable and competent, but still have aspirations to have a family, and you realize that you would have limitations and end up having to compromise your family structure, at times you might not be keen to go at an early stage. And these are issues that need to be fast-tracked in terms of implementation of those policies. We really need equal representativity, and this can be achieved if all policies are put in place and measures to make sure that females do not suffer as opposed to their male counterparts, because they would not have those kind of limitations.
And CM, has the judiciary in this country been held accountable enough for the lack of these clear policies? I mean, even the fact that it was only being discussed broadly in the country or publicly for the first time in the last few months is itself quite shocking.
Well, it is. I mean, within the legal profession, not in terms of judiciary. Recently, the Legal Practice Council does have a code of conduct relating to sexual harassment. But I mean, we find it quite ironic that the judiciary, that needs to be able to lead in respect of this, does not have a broader sexual harassment policy. But not just a policy, there isn't, there needs to be broader implementation. Because we all know that with gender transformation, it also requires a change in values and behaviors. Behaviors, including broader networks of power. And so much more needs to be done. But if we need to be able to start with a framework, and I think for the CJ, which is the current CJ now, there's a clear agenda in terms of the constitutional imperatives, what needs to be done. And I think he needs to place a priority on then having the sexual harassment policy or a broader gender transformation policy in place to ensure that it filters down in the judiciary, both the higher courts, including the lower courts, which is so required. There's more than 230 magistrate courts in the country, and we can just imagine how many women magistrates there are. And we can't say that violence has not entered the judiciary. We can't say that there isn't issues of sexual harassment. But then we are asking the question why those issues are not coming forward. And we do know it's got to do with issues of secondary victimization and whether or not the environment is conducive for those women to be able to come through. So there are clear agendas. I mean, there's a CGE report that was done way back in 2012, which made numerous recommendations in terms of the judiciary, which included how acting judges get appointed. because there in itself lies essence of power. So, and that needs to be regulated, because who gets the opportunity, and how do women judges get through that particular process? Even years, people have been saying that the JSC in itself needs to have processes put in place. And I hope that this process that happened now will show us what happens if those processes are not in place.
Right, Seems my director at the Women's Legal Center, thank you so much for your time. We've also been speaking to Zikhona Ndlebe, who is with the organization Judges Matter. They're regulars here on Newzroom Afrika. Charlotte, thank you very much. Charlotte Mahlaji is a lawyer and secretary, in fact, Secretary General of the Black Lawyers Association. My thanks to you all.